Back in the 1800s, the medical field was definitely a male-dominated field. Black, white, Native American, Hispanic, Latino, whatever, it was male. But in this country at that time, it was white male specifically. But it was never seen to be for women.
Loma Linda is one of the only sectarian hospitals that took women and people of color that survives this movement to accreditation that goes on in 1917. It is not easy for them to make this happen.
Hi, I'm Heidi, a historian and host of They Also Served, where we discover the lives of little-known women who made a big impact on Christianity in America and around the world. The whole idea of progress is things get better over time. They grow, we grow, and when we think of growth, what we picture in our mind often looks and feels pretty linear. But with people and society, growth isn't like that. It's slow, it's messy, it jumps around, and sometimes the growth is erased, and those stages have to be done all over again. In this episode, we're going to talk about 3 incredible women, Mary Britton, Lottie Blake, and Ruth Temple. They face particular challenges because of their gender and their race and their call to the medical field. Yet they created a powerful impact on those lives of those they served and on the society around them. They paved the way for their daughters, nieces, granddaughters, and countless other women to follow in their footsteps. The late 19th century was an exciting time in the United States. Slavery had ended, scientific knowledge was advancing, new cures to illness were being discovered, cities were growing, the United States was expanding west. There was a railroad that crossed the continent, and ship travel across the Atlantic and Pacific was getting faster, more comfortable, and less dangerous. There was a lot of optimism that science and American ingenuity could fix the world's economic, political, and social problems. The period of time is known now as the Progressive Era. There was some space for women between the Civil War and World War I to get an education and move into careers that were reform-oriented.
Women had started being involved in the abolitionist movement, and there had been a feminist movement. Even the early Republic and the late American Republic, there had been a movement for women's education, especially elite women's education.
This is Lisa Clark Diller, a professor of history at Southern Adventist University in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Once women start reading and writing and reading each other's writing, there does develop a network of educated women. They certainly are organizing. They're organizing especially around abolition, but they're also organizing around labor. And especially this is in the North and in urban areas more than it is in the South. When the war starts, it's like every hand on deck.
Many women had read about Florence Nightingale, whose care for soldiers during the Crimean War of the 1850s had inspired many across the globe. Later in the U.S. Civil War, the Union Army desperately needed medical care and sanitation to save the lives of their soldiers. Clara Barton and her band of volunteers rose to the challenge. They knew how to organize, and they knew how to clean, feed families, and care for people's needs.
It didn't necessarily require a ton of skill, although sanitation is becoming more something people are aware of. And a lot of times they were sort of doctors' assistants. There were doctors, there were women doctors that really tried. They were often not allowed to serve as doctors. They were often put in with the nursing, but the only woman to win a Medal of Honor was a physician who got the Medal of Honor for her work as a doctor here in the Civil War battles, Mary Walker, who was also a big advocate for women's wearing trousers. She was a very big advocate early on for women's rights, and she's a very interesting person in her own right. So occasionally the need was so great that they would let women be doctors. But what it did do is it made nursing and medical care for middle-class women who were also educated less problematic. Because this is post-industrial revolution, we have the notion of the middle class. And the middle class are, one of the ways you know you're middle class is the women don't work for a living for wages. You have men that do white collar work, they don't sweat for a living, and they bring a salary, and a woman runs the home. Now, that's not the majority of people. Most people can't afford to do that. Everybody's working. But lower class women weren't seen as being as virtuous as middle class women. Middle class women were the ones who could keep a beautiful family home. A man's home is his castle, and raise the children and provide this sort of environment of peace and tranquility and morality, and not have to deal with the ugly, hateful, nasty things that are outside. But a woman who has to work and has to be rub up against the public is kind of, by definition, can't really be a moral woman. A, because she can't take care of her children in the same way, and B, because she's a public woman and she's probably not totally moral, like she might be taken advantage of by men. So there weren't very many things you could do and be seen as a moral woman for money, one of which had been sort of like teaching or being a nanny. Like you're not quite working class, your virtue is considered to be intact. Being a maid is not. Now being a nurse can enter into that. So Clara Barton worked really hard to make sure that the nurses, there were really high standards for them, that they were seen as respectable, virtuous, beyond reproach. And then they could be, middle-class women could aspire to this in terms of a job and training. And there's also a big revolution in medical knowledge that happens because of warfare. That often does happen because of warfare. A lot more knowledge about how surgery worked, about how sanitation worked. And it built on the early 20th century movement of kind of holistic health and holistic wellness.
In 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to obtain a medical degree in the United States. Decades later, Mary Britton, Lottie Blake, and Ruth Temple would do the same. But they had even more societal pressure and prejudices to overcome than Elizabeth. They were women, and they were Black. Since we're talking about the post-Civil War era, and we're talking especially about Black women, why was it so revolutionary for women, especially Black women, to enter professions and medical careers in the late 19th century?
Well, it's interesting because this is one of those situations where progress doesn't always move directly in a straight line. So there were a lot of opportunities and people going down to help with Reconstruction, especially Methodists, moving into the South after Reconstruction to help set up schools and support systems for what they called the freedmen and women who had been newly emancipated. They were often fairly egalitarian, have some schools that are set up, even to the extent of trying to integrate schools. For instance, what is now University of Tennessee at Chattanooga started as an initiative to help with Southerners expand the education of people in Appalachia. And when they wouldn't allow Black people to attend the school, the Methodists threatened to pull their funding because that they wanted this to be integrated. Women had more options for becoming physicians, and even Black women could too, if their institutions and the Christian institutions they were part of allowed for integration. In the early days of Adventism, a lot of institutions were integrated, especially Battle Creek Sanitarium and the university that was associated with that.
The Adventist Church was active in setting up sanitariums across the United States.
A lot of churches, not just Seventh-day Adventists, definitely had in the era that we kind of associate with the progressive era, the late 19th century, had charitable ministries that they considered to be a really important part of what they did.
The sanitariums usually provided basic nursing care, good nutrition, fresh air, sunshine, exercise, as well as massages, hydrotherapy, and some tonics. Frequently, the Adventists developed nursing schools in conjunction with their sanitariums.
So a lot of it had to do with healthcare and education. The service part of being a Christian was increasingly important in the 19th century, especially in urban areas.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the role of many sanitariums shifted as more knowledge about germs and the medications needed to fight them grew. Several Adventist sanitariums became hospitals during this time. Battle Creek Sanitarium was the largest and most famous of the Adventist sanitariums, and it was run by John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg was a great promoter, and in his heyday, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Amelia Earhart, Eleanor Roosevelt, and U.S. Presidents William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover all visited the sanitarium. He encouraged healthy vegetarian eating and is credited with inventing peanut butter and soy milk as well as developing cold cereal. Battle Creek College, which was adjacent to the sanitarium, also ran a nursing program that was integrated. The nursing school at Battle Creek had been started by one of the first Adventist women physicians, Kate Lindsay, who had graduated with a medical degree from the University of Michigan. Kellogg encouraged women of color to attend Battle Creek College and become medical professionals. Lisa told us about how women caught the vision for advanced medical education.
So the women I read about, there's someone who talks to them, like a person. It's not the church. It's a person or two or several or whatever. They go to church, they meet, that someone comes visits their church who's just been to Battle Creek. So their local church is like, hey, you should go to Battle Creek Sanitarium or what becomes Loma Linda and get training. One of the things the church does is it tells stories all the time. So there's constant publication and stories about doctors and nurses, and the papers include what they might call the colored work. So they are telling those stories in them and talking about the needs that there are and saying, God is calling people to come serve these poor people who have needs. It's almost always an individual calling.
And Mary Britton was one of these women who felt this strong sense of calling.
Mary Britton is one of the very first Black Adventist women to become a physician. And she's born before the Civil War, but she's born to free parents. So she was never enslaved herself. But she's in Kentucky, a border state, and she went to Berea College. So Berea College is kind of the model for actually what a lot of Adventist schools will become. It started in the South after the Civil War as a place where everyone could work, the dignity of work that Adventist colleges still kind of have. Berea College also still has in Kentucky. It's targeted at people in Appalachia that are impoverished. It's integrated from the beginning, intentionally so. It educates women and men together from the beginning.
Mary and her sister Julia became two of the first African American women to attend Berea. Julia is a remarkable woman in her own right, and she became the first African American on the faculty at Berea. Their talented musician mother had fostered in her children a love of learning, and Mary wanted to pass that love of learning on to others.
She became a teacher, and she developed pedagogy. She started an orphanage.
Her experience at Berea encouraged Mary to lend her voice to social causes. Her sister Julia was active in the NAACP, and Mary was active in improving educational opportunities for Black children. They both actively sought to gain women the right to vote.
I have a quote from her that I really liked. If woman is the same as man, then she has the same rights. If she is distinct from man, then she has a right to the ballot to help make laws for her government. She joins the Adventist church kind of in her late 30s or so. And at the time she becomes an Adventist, she's already advocating for civil rights. She speaks to the Joint Railroad Company of the Kentucky General Assembly. She protests the fact that they're starting to segregate the coaches, the trains. She also travels to Chicago in 1892, the same year she became an Adventist, to the World Exhibition. And like a lot of Black Americans, there's a protest because they segregated the tents and the exhibits at the World's Exhibition. A lot of Black Americans were protesting this. She does that. She's barred from going into the Kentucky tent because she's mixed race. When she becomes an Adventist in her 40s, she attends Battle Creek Sanitarium at the encouragement of her church, her local Kentucky church, which was almost entirely white at the time. They are like, you should go to Battle Creek Sanitarium. And when she graduates in 1903, she's the second Black woman to graduate from Battle Creek as a physician. So she had been like 20 years a teacher before she became a physician.
Not content with just one medical degree, Mary also attended Howard Medical School, Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee.
She goes back to Kentucky. She's the state's first Black woman physician, and she practices in Lexington for the rest of her life.
But Mary wasn't the first Adventist African American woman to obtain a medical degree. That woman was Charlotte Blake, also known as Lottie. And Lottie was even younger than Mary was when she received her degree.
She was born Charlotte, aka Lottie, Charlotte Cornelia Isbell. She was born in 1876. She was born in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. That rings a bell, of course. I am Ella Smith Simmons, not hyphenated, just keep my maiden name in there sometimes to remember. Women often kind of lose sight of where they've been, what their journey is when they drop that name, it seems.
In 2005, Dr. Ella Simmons was the first woman to be elected as a general vice president for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists.
I am now, praise God, a retired general vice president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Lottie Blake, she was born in the home of her maternal grandfather, John Charles Duguid. And he was a free Black man who owned a blacksmith shop. And he owned the property adjacent to the Helm House, where General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at the end of the Civil War. She was born on the centennial, 1876. She lived 100 years and died 1976. But the context in which she was born was a Jim Crow South, that is, oppression, segregation, and harsh treatment in general in the South, mainly for Blacks. And there was a great migration out of the South for those who wanted to escape this terrorism to try to find a better life. I think she was about 20 when she came into the Adventist church. So it's right at that time when she was about to go into teaching. She was going to just go to work for the public schools there in Columbus, Ohio. And her church members saw something in her, and they suggested that she go on another path. At that time, for them, it was medical missionary work. So they encouraged her to study in the Adventist Nurses Training School. And this was at Battle Creek, by the way, in the Sanitarium Hospital there in Michigan. She came to live in the home of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Of course, at that time, he was the director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. And so he observed and recognized some great talents in her and some hidden abilities, perhaps, some untapped abilities. And so when she completed the nurses program, he suggested that she not go into the mission field as she was thinking of doing, but rather that she would plan to stay in this country to become a physician and serve people here. And okay, this was something that she had not thought about, but then she enrolled in the American Medical Missionary College, again located there in Battle Creek. So she followed this advice. She went forward. About 1902-ish, she was completing that. And with that, she became the first African-American Seventh-day Adventist to become a degreed medical doctor. She went to serve as the director of the Rock City Sanitarium in Nashville, Tennessee. The beginnings, someone has said, were truly rocky, drawing on the name for this institution.
She ended up experiencing resistance in the community as a Black woman treating conditions with natural remedies. But an epidemic broke out amongst the orphanages, and a plea for help was sent out.
There was an epidemic among the orphans who lived there. So then she accepted a call to Alabama. And that desire to reach, to serve, that missionary spirit took her there. But it was the turn of the century, as we're talking about. This was in the Deep South. The way that the original writer sets this up is that there's this room full of white males ready to sit for the physician's license. And he says this radiant, confident, brown-skinned young woman of 28 years enters the room in this context, filled with white males. And it says there was a crushing silence. You could hear a pin drop. Of course, there were stares, of disbelief. Who is she? Why is she here? And I guess they sensed that she was not the person sent in to clean up the room. Somehow, with her carriage, they knew she was not there for that purpose. And they said, but she could not. She could not be here to take the exam. And here she had been practicing medicine for 2 years by that time. So she just confidently took her seat and began to write the exam. No one wanted to be near her. They didn't want to acknowledge her presence. And I'm sure it was constraint of the Holy Spirit. They didn't just physically exit her from the room, because usually that's what would happen. But somehow they just backed off. And this was a full day of written exams. And she just did what she needed to do. The next morning, after I think the writer said she had been treated like an alien from outer space, there was a change, there was a shift. The instructor came and shared the results of the previous day's exam. The proctor announced that Dr. Lottie Blake, Dr. Charlotte Blake, I'm sure, had scored a perfect paper. Everyone was shocked, and they looked. Suddenly, she had more friends than she could handle. Everyone wanted to be near her. They wanted to talk to her. And the report is, I wasn't there, but the report is, they often copied her paper word for word. So this was 1904, I think, and she scored another triumph, is the way the story ends. And she then was a fully licensed physician for the state of Alabama.
She's one of the physicians that starts the nursing program at what would become Oakwood College. And at the time, they only had white faculty teaching there. She becomes the first faculty of color. She eventually meets her husband, who became a physician, and they and their 5 children spent the time around World War I traveling in the Caribbean, starting mission schools, but they treated malaria and typhoid. They go to Panama, Haiti, Jamaica. Missions allowed scope for work for Black Christians in some ways that it didn't for that they might not be allowed to do back home. And the Blake family traveling in the Caribbean, where there were, which was part of the African diaspora, and they were able to serve the African diaspora in a way that white missionaries may have found more challenging. They both set up, even though they were physicians themselves, they were setting up schools alongside clinics. A lot of the church is very vibrant now in the Caribbean, and a lot of that had to do with Black missionaries like the Blakes that came from the United States. These women are like any missionary who travels and goes internationally. That requires a little extra cultural sensitivity, a little more adventure. I know that the Blakes anyway, I mean, every single person in their family got malaria at one point, and they did only spend 5 to 7 years, I think, in the Caribbean and Panama and Haiti and Jamaica. They were very tough, and they had to be willing to kind of go through all of that. And so I think if you were willing, and there was a sense of desperation for missions, there's a sense of cultural superiority on the part of people from the United States over and against the people that they're taking the gospel to, which meant that even people who wouldn't have all the authority in the United States are still like superior in some way to the people there. What I have observed about women missionaries when I've read my friends' scholarship on that in the 19th century is that they often came back advocates for more egalitarianism than they had been when they went. Like, they didn't start out as sort of being feminists, but they come back like, whoa, we need to be advocating for women. And the same thing can be true for people of color who are going abroad and recognizing some of that inequality. So these Black women, physicians, doctors, their medical training, their education allows them to be the firsts in many ways in places that they wouldn't otherwise have, because they are bringing things that are so desperately needed. And after World War I, they came back and they moved to West Virginia. And there's a large Black population there in West Virginia, in Charleston along the Kanawha River.
The mission field had been tough on the Blakes' health. Shortly after returning to the United States, Lottie's husband developed pneumonia after getting rained on. Her husband died from the illness. Raising 5 small children on her own and trying to financially support them was a struggle. Because of this, Lottie temporarily sent her children to live with relatives. Eventually, she managed to establish a medical practice in West Virginia, and then moved to Columbus, Ohio to live near family and care for her children. Once her children were mostly grown up, she moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she practiced for the next 22 years of her life.
There was this kind of golden age moment in the 1880s and 1890s when definitely women had more options for becoming physicians. To kind of spoiler alert, after the Reconstruction era, as we move into the 1890s and right after 1900, things get worse. For instance, my own town of Chattanooga, the public transportation wasn't segregated until 1903 or 1904. So people that had been riding streetcars together for decades are now all of a sudden not allowed to. After World War I, we start having real accreditation of medical schools.
Medical education was unregulated and therefore varied widely in the United States in the 19th century.
Back in the 1800s, doctors, most of them, they were certainly not educated and not even professionally trained. Many of them just went through an apprenticeship with someone else who called himself a doctor, and they followed them around a while, and pretty soon they started, serving people, and they were called doctor.
Knowledge about germs, vaccinations, and the use of anesthesia was still in its infancy, and penicillin would not be discovered until the 20th century. It was not until the mid-19th century that a physician in Vienna began promoting the idea of washing hands before examining women in childbirth to reduce the risk of women dying from childbed fever. But it took decades for widespread adoption of this simple practice. It's not surprising that patient outcome was not always very good, and many people distrusted physicians. In 1876, the Association of American Medical Colleges was formed to set standards for American medical schools and supervise their programs. The Spanish influenza pandemic, World War I, and the huge number of deaths that resulted from both accelerated the process. There was an increased need to know the causes of diseases and how to treat them. Making sure medical students were knowledgeable about the latest medical research all led to an increased interest in accreditation.
Any school, for-profit school, could open up a medical school, and a person could go for maybe 9 months and get a diploma and go out and practice medicine. But the Flexner Report made all of that obsolete. I'm DeWitt Williams. I'm actually started out as a pastor. I worked as director of the Health and Temperance North American Division from 1990 to 2010. That's when I retired. And since then, I've been doing things like writing and stuff like that. Abraham Flexner was the man who set up the evaluation of medical schools in the United States and Canada, and he brought money with him from the Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Foundation. And if you didn't meet the requirements, your school would close. The Flexner Report, they required physicians to be well-trained. They had rigorous admission criteria. They required well-equipped laboratories, and instructors had to be physician scientists. The medical professors before that time, they could have practices. Many of them had their own practices, but after the Flexner Report was approved, then they had to be primary research people and teachers rather than doing patient care. So it made a big change in what happened in the medical field.
Maybe all of us are like, yay, that's a good thing. But what it meant in practice was that things are just way more expensive and they require more time. Women had a harder time doing it. Also, that people who were poorer had a hard time doing it, which eliminated a lot of Black Americans and minority Americans.
And there were actually 7 Black medical institutions in the United States. at that time, and 5 of them had to close up because they couldn't meet the requirements. And only Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Meharry Medical in Nashville, Tennessee survived as institutions dedicated to educating Black physicians.
While accreditation ensured that physicians were more knowledgeable and patients had a higher chance of survival, the move to accreditation and professionalization pushed women out of medical careers.
So everyone who has a hard time, women in general, Black and white, if you're going to become a physician, it basically means you're not going to be able to have children, is effectively what it would. And this is an era before birth control, right? Up until the 1960s, there wasn't a really great way that you could determine you didn't become pregnant if you were married. It required like an undergraduate degree before you go to medical school, and then extensive training beyond that. And the amount of hours that you had to do of service before you could become fully trained, which meant you weren't getting paid. You were having to pay other people. So the sheer amount of money that it took, the work that you had to do while you were doing it, while you were in school, which prevented you from working for money to help put yourself through school, that's what meant that women specifically, because of childbearing, and second of all, anyone who didn't have a lot of financial resources.
With limited resources and a medical education taking more money and time, women were encouraged to pursue careers in nursing and teaching that required less commitment of resources. It was even tougher for Black women, who often had less access to money and loans than white women.
It's weird because, of course, I think I would like to say, oh, I'm kind of glad that there's accreditation. Like, I wouldn't want to not know for sure if someone who called themselves doctor had appropriate training, right? You know, like this happens all the time in higher education to this day. And then we pile on degrees and we pile on requirements and make it more and more expensive. And every step of the way, it's supposed to be making it better. And in the end, it's like making it super prohibitive. And so now we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough teachers. And it's partly because of all the stuff that we're doing, which is intended to make it better, but has these unintended consequences.
People of color experienced significant challenges everywhere in early 20th century America, but especially in the South.
Jim Crow, which is what the system of segregation laws in the South is called, but there was also a system of segregation policies in the North as well. Like, it's 1900, I think, that we have the last Black congressman from the South that leaves Washington, D.C., because increasingly the voting rights were restricted more and more. Schools were increasingly segregated. Debt peonage. It was much harder and harder for Black Americans to buy land, to develop their own wealth. There were wealthy Black communities that managed to exist. This doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was increasingly segregated and increasingly challenging for them. The schools became segregated. What's interesting is that graduate schools were not segregated. So undergraduate was segregated, but graduate schools were not, which is part of why you can have people being able to go get doctorates or masters or law or medical degrees in some places because there weren't segregated graduate schools for them. Especially around World War I, we have the expansion of participation of Black Americans in the military. And in many ways, this idea that we're making the world safe for democracy. And when Black Americans come back, soldiers, veterans come back from World War I, they are expecting a little bit more rights. And there is a real crackdown on Black Americans and their participation. So there is the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. There's the revival of lynchings, the increase of lynchings. We have 2 of them here in Chattanooga. In one case, we know they did not commit the crime, but they were lynched. And in another case, they never got to go to trial, so we don't know. So we have the increasing of violence against Black Americans, and partly caused by the terrorism against Black people. There is what we call the Great Migration, where there are young people moving to New York and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland, California, and moving to these big cities to get jobs and to escape some of the violence.
Ruth Temple didn't even know women could be physicians as a child.
She thought that the only thing they could become was nurses. because that's all she had ever seen women doing. She saw women being nurses and men being doctors. And so she just didn't realize it.
She was born in Mississippi, but after her father died, her mother, Amy, who had grown up in New York, joined the Great Migration and moved to Los Angeles. In California, Amy worked as a nurse. So just like the other women we have talked about in this episode, Ruth's family helped guide her towards a medical career. Their first contact with Adventism came through Jenny Ireland, a recent graduate from the nursing program in Battle Creek. Jenny had felt called to work with the Black population in central Los Angeles, and she gave health lectures and Bible studies from the home of a postman named Theodore Troy. The Troys invited Ruth's mother, Amy, to attend the health lecture. Amy was excited about the material shared and ended up becoming one of Jenny's first converts. Amy became a founding member of the first Black Adventist church in California. Amy herself became a Bible worker and was instrumental in founding the second Black Adventist church in Los Angeles, as well as teaching countless others about God's love. For Ruth, these experiences in her growing years were instrumental for the path her life would take.
Her brother, Walter, he was out in the backyard playing with gunpowder and pushing it down into a hose and lighting it, and all of a sudden it exploded. So when it was exploded, Mother Amy ran out, and Ruth ran out to see what had happened, and they found that there's black all over his face, and the mother ran away. She just couldn't see. Oh, my son, my son, my son, my son. But Ruth was calm. She ran over to him and took his face and wiped the black all over his face and looked at him, and she saw that he wasn't damaged much, but she comforted him and looked at his eye and everything, and she felt that after she finished, and that this is something that perhaps helping people who are hurt, maybe this is something that she would like to do, become a doctor. She found out that we had at Battle Creek Dr. Kate Lindsay, Dr. Anna Stewart, female doctors, and so she just felt that maybe this is what I want to do, become a doctor. College of Medical Evangelists, CME, that's where she headed. It's known today as Loma Linda University. Ruth was poor. She didn't have any money. But this same man that we talked about, Mr. Troy, Theodore Troy, when he found out that Ruth wanted to be a doctor, he invited her to a forum. He invited Ruth and her sister to come by and explain what Ruth was going to do. And Ruth came by and told him why she wanted to be a doctor and what she was going to do and everything. And so the forum was very impressed. And when she got finished, Theodore Troy stood up and said, I recommend that we support this young lady so that she can get her medical degree. And they voted. And for 5 years, the forum paid for her expenses at Loma Linda. So even though she was poor now, she had made up her mind that a lady can become a physician. There were no other black students in her class. She was the only one. There were 3 ladies, and she was the only black lady.
Ruth believed strongly in the importance of public health and preventative medicine.
During the first 10 years or so, she had a little medical practice. Of course, no white people would come to her. She knew that. She didn't have no white man would come to a woman physician. No white woman would come to a black woman physician. And probably most of the black men would not come to her. So her clientele was usually women, black women, Hispanic women, and so forth.
She ran a health study club and developed a comprehensive total health program to teach people basic ways to avoid getting sick. She advocated for maternal health care, family planning, tuberculosis testing, immunizations, mammograms, and more.
She got married when she was about 35. They moved to the southeast Los Angeles, and they had a nice little 5-room house, and they made it into a clinic. And they called it the Temple Health Institute. And so many people started coming to it. They had so much equipment in it that they moved to the chicken coop.
And the Los Angeles Health Department recognized the importance of her efforts. They granted her a scholarship to attend Yale University School of Public Health to get a master's degree in public health during the midst of World War II. After the war, the city of Los Angeles built a new health clinic and put Ruth in charge of it. In 1962, she officially retired, but continued to work for the Southern California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists as Health Services Director.
There are actually more than one public health clinics in Los Angeles named after her now because of her long-lived work. She also was part of the Harvard University Oral History Project, and she always said,
"At Loma Linda University, I learned to base my medical practice on the holistic community work that Jesus did, as outlined in the ministry of healing. Jesus was the model for doing practical work in communities."
And so these are women who, this becoming a physician and working as a physician was completely embedded in their becoming Adventists, in their being a mature Adventist, in their work for Jesus. Even though things were hard, because they saw themselves kind of as missionaries, I think they weren't surprised that it was hard. The church, I think, also honored them as missionaries in that way.
Well, her story just by itself is inspiring, but because she was a woman and because she was Black, she was a minority, a Seventh-day Adventist minority, a religious minority, and yet she stayed true to her dream to go wherever there was hurt, go where the people were hurting. That was her dream if there's hurt, I'm going to go to that place. I don't know how many people would have been willing to live in a chicken coop and get her husband to live in the chicken coop for 2 years.
Mary Britton, she's always extremely devoted to her local church. She always saw her practice of medicine and her civil rights work as an extension of the holistic gospel that she saw Adventism as promoting. The little church she was part of was integrated for her entire life because the number of Black Adventists was really small. She never married. That was her local church. That was her family. And when she died, that's who she left her belongings to, her things that were of any value.
American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote a poem dedicated to Miss Britton, reflecting on her dedication to education and seeking equality for all. The poem reflects her deep faith in God. He wrote,
"God of the right, arise, and let thy power prevail. Give us to lead our cause more noble souls like hers, the memory of whose deed each feeling bosom stirs, whose fearless voice and strong rose to defend her race, roused justice from her sleep, drove prejudice from place."
Lottie Blake, she spends the rest of her professional life researching communicable diseases, and she develops a cure for the kind of pneumonia called Smoky City pneumonia. That was a big problem they had in Pennsylvania around there. And so she practices medicine and researches that kind of disease that's caused by pollution. The American Medical Association honors her because at the time she died, she was the oldest practicing physician that had been. I don't know if anyone has been practicing medicine at 100, but she had. And she's part of the big oral history project that Harvard University did. She really was a prized member of her community. And by the time she is doing her research in the 40s up in Pennsylvania, the Adventist Church had now developed parallel institutions. So they had Black conferences, and she becomes very active in the Black Adventist Church. She saw the health message of the Adventist Church as super important for the people who are at the most risk for communicable diseases, public health, pollution.
Lottie's grandmother had been a midwife. Her grandmother's example and the encouragement of mentors paved the way for Lottie to enter medicine. In turn, according to her obituary, Lottie inspired other women to become physicians, including a younger aunt, her daughter, a niece, as well as men, including her grandson and a great-grandson.
I look at how this woman lived 100 years, coming from the background growing up during the time she grew up, lived 100 years and practiced medicine, probably 80 of those years. It is still our privilege, even more than responsibility, our privilege to make it the best that it can be in this time, in this situation, for all people in all places. So she was one of these women. Dr. Lottie Blake was one of these women who did that by just being herself, doing what she was called to do. But also, she always had in mind the greater good, not just the patient before me or the lesson before me or the degree that I'm seeking, whatever, the greater good for all people.
I asked what we can learn from the stories of these women.
Things don't go in a nice straight line where there's just a line of progress. The fact that it could become harder to be a doctor, that it's more unlikely to see a woman physician practicing in the early 1950s than in 1903. Like genuinely, in the United States, you're going to be more likely to see a woman doctor in 1903 than in 1953. That is weird to us because we expect, there to be a long line of progress where it's just kind of all unfolding. I think it's hard for us to put that. We want a nice, simple story, and this defies the simple story.
The prevailing thought is often that denominations or religions that believe that the world is ending soon avoid social activism. But even though Mary, Lottie, and Ruth believed that the world was ending soon, they worked to improve the world around them. Why?
How can an apocalyptic people build brick and mortar hospitals and universities and colleges? What are they doing? If you think Jesus is coming, why are you doing this? But Adventists always have said, even though we look for Jesus and we pray for him to come really soon and we see it just over the horizon, we are still going to be wise and we are going to take care of the people that we are around and we are going to work for their long-term benefit. I don't have a great explanation for that other than I think our founders, and I think especially Ellen White, should get a lot of credit for that as somebody who is constantly looking for Jesus to come, but also trying to have us be wise about what we built and how we went about doing it and thinking about the long term, working for the betterment of the communities that we're in, and that our call, the three angels' message, involves the healing of the nations. As we do that, as we live into the new heaven and the new earth and practice Sabbath keeping and practice a holistic, that this is what we do. And these women that I was researching and studying about, they constantly referenced that. They were deeply devout, deeply committed to the second advent, testified to that anytime they could, had literature and invitations to their church and things like that were part of what they did. But they consistently felt that their call to serve the people around them involved things like institutions, like doing research which might not have any implications till decades down the road, building public health infrastructures, educating people, and how can we make the city of Los Angeles, the city of Pittsburgh, healthier places to live, more egalitarian places to live, and working for their church institutions, asking their church to be more egalitarian, showing up at meetings and saying, this isn't right, we need to change this. Not just saying, oh, well, it's okay, Jesus will come and then all of the injustices in the church will be taken care of. This is what being a carrier of the gospel is. I don't have good explanations for why Adventists went that way. And, we're going to try to live forever. And so Jesus doesn't need to come, or we could have been, it's all about the second coming and we shouldn't do any of this building, but we didn't. And I personally think Ellen White living as long as she did, providing these dual kind of commitments for as long as she did, helped us set down some patterns for that. Loma Linda is one of the only sectarian hospitals that took women and people of color that survives the movement to accreditation that goes on in 1917. It is not easy for them to make this happen. They're able to, and yet they also still keep accepting women. If you look at all these early classes of both the nursing schools have more men in them than most nursing schools do, and the medical school classes have more women in them than you usually see. And there are more people of color One of the journals that I read said there was a moment in the 1920s when only 3 schools, medical schools in the United States, would accept Black people, and that was Meharry in Nashville and Howard in D.C. and Loma Linda in California.
Like the Millerites, their view that Christ was coming soon lent an urgency to their mission and meant marginalized groups like women and African Americans were needed for the mission. But as Lisa has pointed out, progress didn't always go in a straight line. Becoming a physician became harder and more expensive for their descendants. But Mary, Lottie, and Ruth paved the way for other women and became examples for other women that wanted to become physicians. Their medical training proved an avenue to help others. These women's legacy lives on in many ways that it's impossible to mention them all. In the lives they saved, the women and men that they inspired to become physicians, the educational programs that they developed, and the treatments for medical conditions that they pioneered. The impact of their lives on those around them was incalculably diffusive. Join me in 2 weeks in our final episode when we meet the current pioneering women.
They Also Served is researched, written, and hosted by Heidi Olson Campbell. Thank you to our guests on today's episode, Dr. Lisa Clark Diller, Dr. Ella Smith Simmons, and Dr. DeWitt Williams. This episode was produced by Heidi Olson Campbell and Heather Moore. They Also Served is edited by Nina Volato. Cover art and social media is by Chelsea Ernina. Stephen Husett is our equipment extraordinaire, and this show was executive produced by Adam Fenner. Thank you to the Adventist Learning Community for making They Also Served possible.